Right, morning all. We'll get stuck into what'll be part two for you guys of 203 week 10. And Dan, you're next up. And this was your chosen image. Yeah, nice use of that shallow depth of field. It is let down a little bit by the depth of field being a little bit too shallow, and that this leaf here, leaf or petal, I suppose technically it's a petal, is out of focus, and it's really large compared to the piece that's in focus. The piece that's in focus is really well lit, which is good, and you've got a reasonable leading line up to here, and I do like what you've done with the bokeh in the background, but really you probably needed to increase that depth of field a little bit just so that you end up with this major part in focus, as well as the piece that's actually bright and sharp. But so yeah, and just flicking through the rest of your images, you've got them all in focus. You are very central with your composition, except for the two cats. Actually, sorry, that's not true. The two cats and the two shots of the girl. Everything else is really central, so you do need to remember that when you're taking your photos, actually think about that composition form when you're actually taking the shots. The other thing that's worth paying attention to is when you've got light like this, if you could have held the rat so that you ended up with the broad side of the light hitting its head, it would be easier to pick that eye as the dominant one. Whereas when you short light like you've done and have this eye in focus, it creates a little bit of a conflict from a compositional point of view, that your eye's wanting to see this one because it's sharp, but this is the one that's under the with the most contrast. But I mean, you've got the definite gist of using film, trying to get those couple of shots to get the task and get it done. I think actually your portrait here is better than the other one. Yeah, there's the problem with the background, and obviously not being able to use cloning and stuff, you can't do anything about that. But that helps develop your awareness of what's actually in the background before you take the shot, and that will help your overall photography. The only thing you need to remember to include in your description is the story that you're trying to tell as well. Other than that, you've justified the rest of it reasonably well. Right, Adrian. Ironically, your justification for your composition on this one is not quite there. So what you wrote on here was, composition-wise, you managed to get the left eye of the image onto the thirds line, and getting that composition there in camera. And you're dead right. That eye is on the thirds, but that's not the reason that this image works. The reason it works from a compositional point of view is you've got the dominant eye in the center, and that means that it looks like the person's looking at you and following you with their eye no matter where you walk. And it's an old artist trick. As far as I know, it goes back to the 1800s or so, potentially even further. The reason that having that other eye on the other thirds isn't working is because it's so dark. And you mentioned that about wanting extra fill light in here, and yes, you're quite right, because you've ended up with a little bit of sunlight reflection off here. So the trick with this one is this is a time where you would actually turn on your on-camera flash and just see what's going to happen, if it's going to actually help, and it probably will. It'll probably pick up those shadows, and of course in any other situation you could do the thing under post-production, but not for this one. You've got a couple of other images here that I would say are stronger. I prefer this building. It's got a really nice strong architectural presence to it, and I really like this shot with the bee. It does need to be cropped at that point down to something like, and obviously that removes it from the running for this one, but something like that, with a little bit of let's be a little bit more careful here, Christopher, and to try and crop it so that we don't end up having those bright highlights around the edge. So this then probably needs a little bit of I'm doing this so that you can see it for later, because I think it's possibly worth putting into a camera club type competition. But a little bit of a vignette in here, and then cloning out. Oops. Oh, it's not going to let me zoom in anymore. You can probably zoom in more on your file. Cloning out those little pieces that are cropped off on the edge, just to neutralize that, and that bit there. Oh, that's not cloned particularly well, but you make sure that your edge doesn't have bright spots on it, and yeah, that's quite a nice little image with the bees. They're not easy to get, and it's an interesting mass of flowers. So you do have some other strong shots in there, and I think stronger in terms of storytelling, even this one as a sculpture, because you've caught the way that the shadows from the trees are wrapping around the sculpture. It's just got that little bit more of a sense to it than the one that you chose, which, yeah, it's just the statue. There's nothing else there in terms of story. If you had the light wrapping around it, same as the other one, then that would change the picture as well. But so yeah, I mean, you've obviously, from your comments, you enjoyed the exercise, and yeah, it seems to help people just get into their heads and get into the way, thinking about the way that the camera works and slowing down and taking the shots rather than jumping on and just blasting off the shots as fast as possible. But yeah, interesting challenges. Right, Chirp, let's have a look at your set. And there's some really interesting shots in here. There's some that haven't quite worked as well as they could, and I think for a number of them you're missing having a person in them. And a model floating around would have been really useful for at least a couple, particularly the one that you actually chose as your best shot. If you'd actually got somebody sitting on the bench seat, then it would have really changed what the image was doing. At the moment it feels like a nice background for something, but it's not quite there. I think from a storytelling point of view, this one's definitely the most interesting. You've got 3 different layers going on. You've got the frame of the garage, I suppose, because you've then got a car in behind, and the reflection of the conservatory in that. And yeah, while it's quite complicated as an image, I think that one's my favourite of them. But I have a suspicion, yeah, we've ended up with blown out highlights. So I can see why you potentially wouldn't have chosen it, but you've still got an exposure issue with your highlights on this one, so it's no better from that point of view. And in fact, the other one that I really like is this one, because you've got a really nice use of leading lines. Just kind of needed to wait for that car that's in the garage to come out. And again, you mentioned this, I think, about the post-production needing to pull back those highlights a little bit. The saturation of the green, though, isn't so much an issue. If we're being really fussy, the foliage is not fantastic there, but the play of shadows on the ground is quite interesting. These two, now they're a bit flat, really. They do work in the terms of the story, taking you through what's going on. I really like this one, if only we didn't have the burnt out highlight here, and that just needed potentially to be you zoom in a little bit more and back up slightly so you keep the size of the flower the same, and just watch what's going on in your background. And that one you mentioned about cropping and playing it anyway, playing with it in post-production, which, yeah, I can see it making something out of it, but in and of itself it's not quite there yet. So yeah, you've got a really interesting collection of images there, but the challenge is exposure. On that bright day where you've got those highlights, they're either blown out or you've gone for shots that are in the shade, and so the lighting on here isn't so good. and in fact you've ended up with your blown out highlights there as well, so that is something to keep a fairly close eye on. Right, Lisa, so you mentioned in your blurb here about the using the top third line. That top third line is only half of the rule of thirds. When you've got an actual object that's really strong, you want that to be on the third line intersection, so either here or here. With this particular shot, I would probably try, well, I would have probably panned across a little bit so that you ended up with some more room on this side, because you've got some nice, you've got the flowers nicely out of focus here. This one's clearly the focal point, which works really well. But with your current composition, you've got this strip of red here that really grabs your eye and fights with what should be the more dominant flower. So if you pan across a little bit, use that gap as your cutoff, and hopefully something on this side that would have worked, or potentially zoomed in or moved closer. Certainly your shallow depth of field with a relatively small f-stop is good. Lighting on all of the images, as you mentioned, was really flat, and in this case you actually want a little bit of contrast to it, so just waiting for the sun to try and break through the clouds and give you a little bit more directional light would have been quite good. Of course not if it's midday, but yeah, it's just feeling a little bit flat. It's not as nice and as warm as it could be, and lacking some of that depth in the shots. And as I said, that goes through pretty much all of them. But you've got the right idea in terms of utilizing this as a film and taking multiple shots and playing with angles. This one here, be aware what's happening in the background. You've cut the top of her off because it's going through this grey piece. If you could have got into a position where you ended up with the whole thing silhouetted by the orange, that could work much better. And yeah, what's going on in the background with statues is really quite important. And this one has the potential of being such a nice photo, but it's just it's a blur day. It's overcast and not really giving you anything particularly nice to say about it. In terms of your composition, you've utilised that on the thirds. This one gives you a nice offset. Would have been great to have somebody out in the garden, but again, probably not going to happen on a day like that. And just be careful around the edges of your image, particularly when you're shooting in camera, when you can't crop later, that you just want to make sure that you keep those edges clean. It looks like you probably aimed to, but some cameras actually just take a little bit extra as well, which is somewhat frustrating. Right, Rebecca. Oh, I had to laugh at your comments, and the reason for it was I was going through your images before I read the comments, and I was thinking exactly the same thing. Too used to using digital, because yeah, you're quite right. Exposure-wise, it's not playing ball. Frustratingly, so that one shouldn't be in there. Frustratingly, the thing that we lack in digital is that dynamic range that we would have if it was a film camera, and yeah, we don't for the sake of this task. So yeah, I can definitely see that this is the strongest one given what you're working with. However, once you get your little mitts on Adobe Camera Raw, and thank goodness you got it, you can hopefully get something out of it like that, which I think you'll be well pleased with. And yeah, it's a difficult series to take for film, and I think you've done a nice job compositionally. It's working with that leading line, bringing us in. You've caught the wave just breaking there, a little bit of hint in the sun. Potentially we could push the exposure up a little bit more, but yeah, there's not much more lenience, excuse me, within that sunset, and if you do push it too much further, it starts losing its color saturation. And obviously you did that in this one. Well, that's a 30-second exposure. I'm not surprised you got caught out. And yeah, that happens. I really do like the effect that you've managed with a 30-second exposure. But yeah, it's just the lights changed too much to be able to get it. Have to say though, given I'm a Wellingtonian and I still haven't shot that lighthouse, that's one of those places that is going back on the list of locations to go and do. But yeah, you've done a nice job, and certainly I think that you're going to get some really nice images out of it once you get to play with your post production as well. And I'd be pleased to see them. You can drop me an email with one of them when you're done. Right, Tricia, let's have a look at yours. And as an interesting series in here, I like the use of the ring. It's ended up giving you a focal point on some of the shots that would have been potentially quite bland, and you've not quite nailed the focus on that one, which is fair enough in terms of why it didn't get in. I think that's borage, and interesting use of the angle for that one. And some of these you've utilized an interesting play with depth of field. The challenge compositionally though is if you've got something that's out of focus in the foreground, it tends to feel like it's blocking your view into the object. So this would probably work better if you'd actually got a greater depth of field and had this tree trunk in focus and off to the side a little bit more, acting as a frame rather than quite so central. Similar thing with this one here. Looking through the hole is an interesting idea, but you need maximum depth of field to pull that one off so that this piece of statue is in focus as well, and not have this piece of black here. So probably actually turn this into shoot it as a portrait shot rather than landscape. Same with these flowers here. Nice. These ones that are out of focus in the background work really well. The red ones in the foreground don't work quite so well. This was your chosen shot, and I can see why. You've caught the sparkle on the ring. I would have gone for a little bit more of an f-stop. You've only got f2.8 there. Just increase it a little bit more. It's going to give you more clarity around the ring. And you mentioned that if you could post-production, post-process it, you would hit it with a bit more clarity, which is exactly what using that little bit more depth of field should do. It's just going to give you a little bit more sharpness over that depth. But I still like it, and I like the story that it's telling behind the gems themselves, which are obviously from rocks, and you've got another type of rock there. Now, whether or not you know it, you've got an igneous rock, unless I totally miss my geology underneath, and of course that's where we tend to find most of our diamonds, in or next to volcanic cones that have occurred underground. So a little bit of geology for the day. Right, Melanie, let's have a look at yours, and we'll start with your chosen image. Interesting use of leading lines, and I can see that working. You mentioned about having to wait until the bridge was clear and not having any walkers. I'm actually really disappointed you didn't wait until a walker came round this corner, because at the moment you've got all this tension leading you to this one point, but there's nothing there at the end of the bridge. If you'd waited for somebody to come across that bridge, particularly if they were running and you just caught them as they came round that corner, it would give the image a whole different dimension, and give it some sense of timing with it. Unfortunately, you've got some large issues in terms of your exposure. It's a very bright day and you've not controlled those highlights, and so that is a challenge. You can't underexpose it too much because of the fact that you've ended up with that bright day, but you probably could have dropped it by half a stop, and I think that would have probably got you some detail in there. to avoid the sky being blown out, pretty much the only way of dealing with that is to crop it. Now, you could have cropped it in camera and just dropped down, but the other thing that can work quite nicely is if you lift the camera up even higher and shoot down on it a little bit more, then you can actually exclude the really bright sky, which is drawing your eye up to it, and just include more of the bridge. You still potentially end up having this line here being a distraction and blown out, but it's then at least leading you to this point. In terms of the other images, you've got some really interesting ones. I really like this from a minimalistic point of view. It tells quite an interesting story, and you framed it quite nicely. Some of the other landscape ones or seascape ones, it's the wrong time of day to really be taking them. That's quite a nice one of the flower. Just get in there and move this plant that's in behind, so you've got a nice clean image. That one's a little bit more of a snapshot. This one, you've not taken the time to make sure that your camera is actually level before you take the shot. That's quite important. That one's quite nice. There's a nice use of the shadow coming, the light coming through the flowers. That's quite an interesting story. I wonder what this black cable is. I think either getting in closer and losing it or including it would have been a good idea. Park bench, again, the lighting's too flat at this point in time, in that it's middle of the day, and not so flat from the fact that we're not getting shape and to the object, rather than flat lighting in that it's overcast. But yeah, early morning would be a much better time to try and take this and capture some of the texture in that, and same with most of the others. Yeah, time of day is a critical one. I think that most of these were taken around lunchtime. Right, Jody, you obviously missed part of the brief, and that was no cropping. All your cropping had to be done in camera, as you take the photo, which is really, really frustrating because I really, really like this image. And as I've done with somebody else, you have the option to resubmit the image without the crop, and I will remark it. But you're not allowed to do. You need to follow your instructions, girl. Sorry, lady. Just frustrating when you come up with you've got a number of really nice images in here, and you've just missed that key part of the task, which is kind of irritating. In fact, you've got a large number of photos in here that are really cool. Really nice use of depth of field in there, and even the bee, just nicely isolated from the rest. A lovely landscape shot. What is that? I have no idea. I'm presuming it's a water garden feature. Yeah, peacock, I can see why you'd take it. It's not quite behaved itself. I think if you tilted this one on an angle so that the stem came up from the corner, that may potentially work better. But yeah, you've got some stunning shots in there. But please drop me a line and re-upload this one without the crop in it. Cheers. Alright, and that's it for this week. So guys, it is really important that you read your instructions carefully, and if you're unsure about something, please let me know. I know if at least one person decided that they thought they knew what they meant by cropping in camera, and it wasn't the same thing. That's as much my issue with that's an assumption of methodology, but I thought we'd updated it, and apparently that update got lost. So yeah, if you're unsure about something, please drop me an email. Much easier to sort out beforehand than afterwards. But well done. Hopefully that task gave you guys a little bit of an idea as to how you can kind of push yourselves if you're after an exercise to freshen up your photography. I don't suggest that you do it for your assignments every week. You might want to start off doing it that way and then carry on, but don't put that extra pressure on yourself on a weekly assignment basis. You've got more than enough to play with. So yeah, I think that's it for this time, and as always, have fun. Happy shooting.